Cassidy Hart could feel her body shutting down. Hours working as a waitress, followed by another shift answering calls at a soul-draining call center, had stripped her of any energy she had left. Her legs trembled, and her feet throbbed so intensely they barely felt like part of her anymore. Every step was a battle. By the time she reached the wooden bench near the hospital, the weight of exhaustion finally crushed her resolve. She collapsed onto the bench, her shoulders slumping under the invisible burden she carried. Her chest tightened, not just from fatigue but from the anxiety gnawing at her insides. If I stop now, if I don't keep going, what will happen to Eleanor? The thought consumed her, drowning out everything else. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to fight off the darkness creeping at the edges of her vision. But the waves of exhaustion were too strong. Her heart raced unevenly. I just need to rest for a second. Just 1 second. Then I'll get up and go. But even as she thought it, a whisper of panic clung to her pulse. Eleanor is waiting. I can't leave her alone. And then everything went black. James Ford was stepping out of the hospital's back entrance when he saw her. He was coming off a long and unpleasant meeting with one of the hospital's research teams. Just another futile conversation reminding him that no matter how much money he threw at their projects, some things remained beyond his control. His mother's face flashed uninvited in his mind, a painful ghost that lingered despite his best efforts to bury it. It was a face he hadn't been able to save. Then his eyes landed on her, a young woman slumped awkwardly on a bench, her head lolling to one side, as if the weight of the world had finally crushed her. For a moment, all he could do was stare. She looks like she's been through hell. His first instinct was to keep walking. Strangers fainting in public wasn't his problem. But something inside him wouldn't let him. Maybe it was the way her features seemed to mirror his mother's exhaustion during her last days. Or maybe it was just guilt, gnawing at him for not being able to do more back then. Whatever it was, James didn't think twice. He crossed the space between them in a few long strides and crouched down beside her. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice low but urgent. He gave her shoulder a gentle shake, trying to rouse her without scaring her. Cassidy stirred, her eyelids fluttering open slowly. For a moment, her gaze was distant, like she was struggling to piece together where she was. The world came back to her in jagged fragments: hospital lights, James's unfamiliar face, and a sharp reminder of how much time she had just lost. Her pride kicked in before her logic. She tried to sit up straight, brushing off his touch as if to convince both of them that she was fine. I'm okay," she murmured, though her voice was barely audible. Her throat felt raw, and every word scraped against it like sandpaper. Just tired. James could tell right away that wasn't the full story. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, and there was a shadow in her eyes, a weariness that didn't come from a bad day but from months, maybe years, of barely holding on. "You don't look okay," he said gently, though his tone left little room for argument. Cassidy forced a weak smile, one that didn't reach her eyes. "Really? I just need to get home." Her legs wobbled beneath her as she tried to stand, and James instinctively reached out to steady her. "Whoa, easy," he said, gripping her arm just in time to stop her from falling flat on her face. "You're not going anywhere like this." "I have to," Cassidy muttered under her breath, her frustration rising. "Eleanor's waiting for me." But the moment she put weight on her feet, the world tilted violently. She gasped as her knees buckled. James caught her before she hit the ground, his grip firm but careful. For a second, she just leaned against him, too drained to fight. "You're coming with me," James said, and his voice had that calm authority of someone used to being obeyed. Cassidy shook her head weakly. I don't need a hospital," she whispered, but her resistance was paper-thin. The truth was, she couldn't summon the strength to argue. "You're not really in a position to argue," James replied, tightening his hold just enough to keep her upright. "And I'm not about to leave you here to collapse again." Cassidy's pride flared up, but she knew she had lost this battle. A stranger, some arrogant, self-assured man, had decided to help her, whether she liked it or not. But what choice did she have? The humiliation burned at her, but exhaustion dulled the edges of her anger. "All right," she whispered finally, almost to herself. "But just for a minute." James gave a small nod, not pressing further. "She doesn't realize it yet, but she's not going to make it home on her own tonight." With one arm around her shoulders, he guided her away from the bench, his other hand steady at her waist. Cassidy wanted to hate the way she had to lean on him, how he made it look so easy, but she was too tired to care. As they reached the entrance of the hospital, Cassidy's mind drifted back to Eleanor. "I need to call my grandmother," she said softly, almost as if she were reminding herself. "We'll take care of it," James assured her, his voice low but steady. "First, let's get you checked out. Then you can call whoever you need." Cassidy gave a small nod, though worry gnawed at her. Every minute she wasn't with Eleanor felt like another failure. "I shouldn't be the one needing help. Eleanor is the one who needs me." But her body had betrayed her tonight, and she had no choice but to let this stranger lead her through the hospital doors. As the automatic doors slid shut behind them, James glanced down at the woman by his side. "Whoever you are," he thought, "you've been running on empty for too long." And in that moment, James made a decision, one he hadn't intended when he stepped out of the hospital that night. He wasn't going to walk away from this. Not this time. Cassidy sat stiffly in the hospital's waiting room, her hands clenched in her lap as she tried to mask the growing frustration gnawing at her. The dull hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of nurses exchanging notes grated on her nerves. "What the hell am I doing here?" She hated feeling this exposed, hated needing anyone, especially a stranger like James Ford. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see him sitting beside her, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He had barely spoken since they entered the hospital, and that silence felt heavier than she expected. Cassidy shifted in her seat, trying to focus on the peeling edges of a magazine cover on the coffee table instead of the tension wrapping itself around her chest. "I need to get out of here. Eleanor is waiting." James broke the silence first. His voice was even, but there was a weight behind it, something almost too careful. "You work too much, don't you?" Cassidy shot him a sidelong glance, caught off guard by the question. He wasn't wrong, but it still felt intrusive. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, buying herself a moment. "Why do you care?" "I work as much as I have to," she said, her tone clipped. "Life doesn't wait for anyone to catch their breath." The words came out sharper than intended, but Cassidy didn't care. Sympathy was the last thing she needed. People like him, the wealthy, the privileged, had no idea what it felt like to scrape by, paycheck to paycheck, while time ran out on someone you loved. James leaned back in his chair, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. His gaze wasn't pitying, but there was a quiet understanding in it that made her uneasy. "What is he seeing in me?" "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "My mother. She was the strongest person I knew." His voice lowered slightly, as if he was letting Cassidy see a side of him most people didn't. But even strength isn't enough by itself. She worked herself to the bone. And it still wasn't enough. Cassidy clenched her jaw, feeling a sting at the back of her eyes that she refused to acknowledge. She glanced away, focusing hard on the clock ticking on the far wall. "I don't need to hear this." James let the silence stretch for a moment before speaking again, his voice deliberate, like he'd rehearsed the next part in his mind. "I run a company. A health tech startup, to be specific. Maybe there's a way I can help." Cassidy blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" James straightened in his chair, shifting slightly toward her. There was a sense of purpose in the way he spoke now, each word carefully chosen. "I'm offering you a job. Not as charity," he added quickly, as if he knew that would be her first objection. "You're resourceful, tough, and it's clear you need a break. We could use someone like you." Cassidy stared at him, disbelief swirling in her mind. What the hell is this guy playing at? She wasn't sure whether to feel suspicious, grateful, or insulted. Her skepticism slipped into her voice. "Why would you offer me a job? You don't even know me." James gave a small, almost amused smile. "I know enough. I know you're trying to hold everything together on your own. And I know that if you keep going the way you are, you're going to crash." He paused, then added softly, "I've seen it before." Cassidy's heart pounded in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She wanted to dismiss him, to tell him he didn't know anything about her or her life, but the truth in his words left her defenseless. Still, she wasn't about to make this easy for him. "Even if I believed you," she said slowly, "how does this help me? How does this help Eleanor?" James nodded, as if he had expected that question. "We have access to experimental treatments through the company. Early trials. They aren't available to the public yet, but I can try to get your grandmother into one of them." The mention of Eleanor's name hit Cassidy like a punch to the chest. She sat up straighter, narrowing her eyes. "Is this real?" She studied his face, searching for any sign that this was some kind of trick. What exactly do you mean by experimental treatments? She asked cautiously, her voice low but urgent. You're saying you could help her? There's no guarantee, James admitted, his expression serious. But it's a shot. One she might not get otherwise. For a moment, the room seemed to tilt, the gravity of his offer sinking into her. A chance. A real chance. She couldn't afford to ignore it. Eleanor was all she had left, and every day without treatment felt like a clock ticking down. But Cassidy knew better than to trust too quickly. She crossed her arms, her gaze sharp. What do you want in return? James met her eyes, steady and unflinching. Nothing you aren't already doing. Just work with us. Bring that same grit and determination I've already seen in you. Cassidy held his gaze, still not fully convinced. There's always a catch. Always. Why me? She pressed. You could hire anyone. Why would you go out of your way to help a total stranger? James hesitated, and for a second, something flickered in his expression, something vulnerable that Cassidy wasn't expecting. Maybe, because I couldn't help the person I should've, he said quietly. And this feels like a second chance. His words hung between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Cassidy felt her defenses waver for the first time since they'd met. He's not just some rich guy playing savior. There was a rawness in his voice that told her this was personal. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. Every instinct told her to be cautious, to say no. But then Eleanor's face flashed in her mind. Her smile, her tired eyes, the way she always squeezed Cassidy's hand as if to say, "Don't give up on me." This wasn't just about Cassidy anymore. It never had been. "Okay," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I'll do it." James gave a small nod, his expression softening slightly. "Good." Cassidy leaned back in her chair, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. She had no idea what she was getting herself into, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like there might be a way forward. James stood, slipping his phone from his pocket. "I'll get everything set up. We'll start as soon as you're ready." He glanced at her, and for the first time since they met, there was a hint of warmth in his eyes. "And Cassidy, I'm not just offering you a lifeline. I need you to believe that." She gave him a small, reluctant nod. "We'll see." As James turned to make a call, Cassidy stared at the hospital wall, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't what she had expected when she collapsed on that bench. And yet, here she was, on the edge of something new, something that could change everything. But deep down she knew, the real fight hadn't even started yet. Cassidy's first day at the startup felt like stepping onto a stage mid-play, with no script and no idea where she fit. The sleek office gleamed with glass walls, rows of modern desks, and employees who seemed wired into their screens, moving fast and speaking faster. Conversations buzzed around her, filled with jargon and acronyms she wasn't familiar with. It was nothing like the chaotic, sweaty shifts she was used to. This place felt sharp, polished, and unrelentingly precise. Cassidy adjusted the strap of her bag over her shoulder, feeling every inch like an outsider. "Sink or swim, Hart," she told herself. But no amount of pep talk could erase the weight of those silent stares that lingered a beat too long, the unspoken questions in people's glances. What's she doing here? She could see it already. Employees dressed to impress, carrying themselves with the confidence of people who belonged here. Cassidy, in her simple blouse and worn-out shoes, stood out like a sore thumb. Just keep your head down. Do your job. Get what you need for Eleanor. She had barely found her desk when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ah, you must be the boss's new favorite." Cassidy turned, her eyes narrowing slightly as she sized up the man who had spoken. He leaned casually against a nearby desk, arms crossed over his chest, a smug smile playing on his lips. He was tall, with perfectly combed dark hair and the kind of smooth, expensive-looking suit that screamed power. Everything about him, from the way he carried himself to the way he looked at her, said he was used to being in control. "Martin Blake," the man said, offering his hand with a smile that was just a little too polished. "Chief Operating Officer." His tone was friendly, but Cassidy could sense the calculation behind it. She shook his hand, her grip firm. "Cassidy Hart." Martin's grip lingered just a second too long, as if testing her. His smile didn't falter, but Cassidy caught the subtle flicker in his eyes. Curiosity, amusement, and something else she couldn't quite place. "I've heard a lot about you," Martin said, his voice smooth and measured. "James has been unusually enthusiastic about your arrival." Cassidy tilted her head slightly, offering him a small, controlled smile. I know your type, she thought. Charm on the outside, poison underneath. She'd met people like him before. People who smiled with their teeth but waited for the perfect moment to strike. I wouldn't get too excited, she said, her tone deliberately neutral. I'm just here to do my job. Martin's eyes gleamed, as if he enjoyed the challenge. He didn't seem the least bit put off by her cool demeanor. Instead, he stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly, like they were already sharing some inside joke. Well, I hope you don't have unrealistic expectations, Martin said, his words laced with subtle insinuation. It can be tough here. Especially for someone in your position. Cassidy met his gaze head-on. I faced worse than you, she thought, her stomach tightening. She didn't flinch under his stare, nor did she offer him the deference he was clearly used to. I've dealt with tough before, she said, a faint edge creeping into her voice. This place doesn't scare me. Martin gave a slow, deliberate smile, as if amused by her response. But there was no warmth in it, just cold calculation. You'll find, he said, tilting his head slightly, that we play by different rules here. He let the words hang in the air, a thinly veiled warning. Cassidy stared at him for a beat longer, refusing to look away. She wasn't about to let him intimidate her, not on her first day, and definitely not after everything she'd already been through. Martin's smile widened, but his eyes remained cold. Interesting, they seemed to say. Let's see how long you last. Well, Martin said smoothly, breaking the silence. If you need anything, you know where to find me. We're all very interested in seeing how things turn out for you. The way he said it made her skin crawl. This guy's trouble, Cassidy thought, her instincts sharpening. Martin gave her one last look, half challenge, half amusement, before turning on his heel and strolling away, as if he'd already won some invisible game she didn't know she was playing. Cassidy exhaled slowly, her jaw tight. Okay, first enemy identified. She had no doubt that Martin Blake was going to be a problem. And not just because he didn't trust her. He was the kind of man who would go out of his way to make sure she failed. But failure wasn't an option. Not with Eleanor depending on her. Not when she'd already come this far. With a steadying breath, Cassidy turned back to her desk, forcing her mind to focus. I'm not here to make friends. I'm here to win. She opened her laptop, her fingers poised over the keyboard, ready to dive into whatever was thrown her way. Whatever game Martin was playing, she'd make damn sure she was ready for it. Martin watched her from across the room, arms folded as he leaned against the glass wall of his office. A faint smirk played at the corner of his mouth as he observed her, silently assessing every move she made. She's tougher than she looks, he murmured to himself, a note of amusement in his voice. But his eyes darkened with something else, a flicker of irritation perhaps. We'll see how long that lasts. He had been at this company long enough to know when someone was a threat. And Cassidy Hart? She wasn't just some nobody from off the street. James Ford wouldn't have brought her in if she didn't matter. And that was exactly the problem. Martin's jaw tightened. James is making a mistake with her. Whatever favor Cassidy had earned from the boss, Martin would make sure it didn't last. He had no intention of letting her disrupt the careful balance of power he had built. Back at her desk, Cassidy kept her focus sharp, but the interaction with Martin lingered in the back of her mind. She could feel his presence like a shadow hovering at the edges of her vision, waiting for her to slip up. Not happening. She might not have known much about tech startups, but Cassidy knew how to survive. She had spent her whole life fighting for every inch she'd gained, and this place, polished floors and glass walls included, was no different. As she typed away, a quiet determination settled over her. Martin Blake wasn't the first arrogant man she'd had to deal with, and he sure as hell wouldn't be the last. Just as she was starting to get into the flow of things, she felt someone approach. She looked up to see Lisa, a slender woman with a sharp gaze and a slightly mischievous smile, hovering by her desk. Hey, Lisa said casually, leaning on the edge of Cassidy's desk. I saw you talking to Martin earlier. Cassidy raised an eyebrow. Yeah? What about it? Lisa smirked. Just, don't take anything he says personally. He likes to test new people. See if they'll crack. Cassidy leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. Good to know. Lisa tilted her head, studying Cassidy with a hint of curiosity. Most people flinch when Martin turns on the charm. Cassidy gave a small, dry smile. Yeah well, I'm not most people. Lisa grinned. I think I'm gonna like you. Cassidy didn't respond, but for the first time since she walked into the building, she felt a little less alone. The days at the startup became a blur of meetings, emails, and deadlines. Cassidy buried herself in the work, determined to learn as much as possible, as quickly as possible. Every new process she uncovered, every obscure system she figured out, felt like one more step toward proving she deserved to be there. If I keep moving, keep working, there's no time to doubt anything. But her life outside the office was a careful balancing act. At night, she rushed to the hospital to spend time with Eleanor, sitting by her bedside as her grandmother's fragile frame grew weaker. Even on her worst days, Eleanor always smiled when Cassidy walked through the door. "You're still my stubborn girl," Eleanor would say, squeezing Cassidy's hand with what little strength she had. Cassidy returned the smile every time, though the weight in her chest grew heavier with each visit. "Just hold on a little longer. I'm going to figure this out." One evening, after a particularly long day at the office, Cassidy mentioned James during one of their conversations, without even realizing how much she brought him up lately. Eleanor's eyebrows lifted, and a knowing smile tugged at the corners of her pale lips. "He seems to like you," Eleanor remarked softly. Cassidy blinked, caught off guard. "Who? James?" She gave a small laugh, brushing the idea off. "He's just being nice. That's all." Eleanor's smile deepened, as if she knew more than she was letting on. "Sure, darling." Cassidy shook her head, amused but dismissive. Grandma always loved her little matchmaking theories. Yet the thought lingered longer than she wanted to admit. At work, James Ford began to show up more and more in Cassidy's day-to-day routine. It wasn't something she had expected. At first, she thought he'd drop her into the company and move on. But it became clear that wasn't his plan. He started inviting her to lunch, always suggesting the rooftop terrace, where the view stretched across the skyline. It became their thing. Whenever the pressure of the office became too much, they'd escape to the terrace and sit across from each other, sharing stories that felt oddly personal. Cassidy realized how little she knew about him beyond the rumors of his wealth and brilliance. But here, away from the polished boardrooms and endless email threads, James was different, more open, more human. During one of these lunches, she couldn't help but ask the question that had been nagging at her for a while. "Why do you do this, James?" Cassidy leaned forward, resting her forearms on the table between them. "I mean, the startup, this whole operation. And," she hesitated for a moment before continuing, "helping me." James stared out at the view for a moment, as if weighing how much of the truth to reveal. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than usual. "My mom," he began. "She needed treatment for a condition that was complicated, expensive. But back then, there wasn't anything like this. No early trials, no experimental solutions. Nothing that could help her." He paused, his jaw tightening slightly as the memory surfaced. "She didn't make it," James said, his gaze distant. "And it stayed with me, knowing that maybe, just maybe, if someone had done things differently, she could have had a chance." Cassidy sat in silence, letting the weight of his words settle between them. It was the first time she had seen him so raw, so unguarded. He wasn't the powerful CEO or the wealthy entrepreneur in that moment. He was just a son, still carrying the burden of what he couldn't change. "I guess," James continued, exhaling slowly, "helping people like you. It feels like a way to fix something I couldn't back then." He glanced at her, his expression both vulnerable and resolute. "Maybe that's selfish. Or maybe it's just the only way I know how to make it right." Cassidy swallowed hard, caught off guard by the honesty in his words. He didn't have to tell me any of this. For the first time since they met, she felt like she understood him, really understood him. "Thank you," she whispered, "for not giving up on me. On any of this." James gave her that soft, almost hesitant smile she was starting to recognize. "I could say the same to you." They sat there for a moment longer, the silence between them comfortable this time, not awkward. It felt like they had crossed some invisible line, shifting from two people thrown together by chance to something closer, something that wasn't quite friendship but wasn't far from it either. Over the next few days, their connection deepened in subtle ways. They found themselves gravitating toward each other at odd moments, during coffee breaks, in brief hallway conversations, even in the small gestures that said more than words ever could. Cassidy noticed the way James seemed to sense when she was overwhelmed, always finding a way to pull her out of the chaos before it swallowed her whole. And she found herself looking forward to those moments, even though she knew she shouldn't. She kept reminding herself that this wasn't permanent, that James's help was a lifeline, not a relationship. Don't get too comfortable. But it was hard not to, especially when James made her feel seen in a way no one else had in a long time. One evening, as they walked back from the terrace together, James glanced sideways at her. "You know," he said, his tone light but genuine, "you're a lot stronger than you give yourself credit for." Cassidy smiled faintly. "I've had to be." James nodded, as if he understood that better than most. "Well, it shows." For the first time in a long time, Cassidy allowed herself a moment to feel something other than stress, something close to hope. Maybe things really can get better. But even as their bond grew stronger, Cassidy knew it wouldn't be that simple. She could feel the weight of her responsibilities pressing down on her, Eleanor's worsening condition, the challenges at work, and the lingering presence of Martin Blake, whose cold gaze followed her everywhere. Cassidy had no illusions about how difficult the road ahead would be. She knew there were battles she hadn't even seen coming yet. But with James by her side, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she might actually have a chance. As they reached the office doors, James gave her a small reassuring nod before heading back to his desk. Cassidy watched him walk away, a quiet thought settling in her mind. "I'm not alone in this anymore." Cassidy's pulse raced as she stared at the screen in front of her. A folder buried deep within the startup server had revealed exactly what she feared: documents detailing unauthorized treatments administered to patients without proper consent. Test data, confidential reports, and email threads all pointed to a deliberate cover-up. And at the heart of it all, Martin Blake. Her stomach turned. If this got out, it wouldn't just destroy the company, it would put Eleanor's treatment at risk. If the board catches wind of this, they'll pull every experimental program. Eleanor won't have a chance. Cassidy clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe. Stay calm. Think. You can't afford to panic. She knew she had to act, but she needed help, James's help. He was the only person in this place she could trust. Heart pounding, Cassidy grabbed her phone and sent him a short, urgent message. "We need to talk. Now." James's office was quiet, the glass walls offering a view of the bustling workspace beyond. But as Cassidy stepped inside, it felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. James looked up from his desk, instantly sensing the tension in her expression. "What's going on?" he asked, setting his tablet aside. Cassidy shut the door behind her, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the printed documents she had brought. She slid them onto his desk without a word, watching as his brows furrowed while he scanned the pages. "These are internal files," James murmured, flipping through the papers. "Where did you find these?" "They were buried in the server," Cassidy said, her voice tight. "Martin's been running unauthorized trials. Treatments that haven't been approved yet, on patients who didn't consent to them." James's face darkened as the weight of her words sank in. Cassidy continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. "If this gets out, everything we've built will collapse. And if the board pulls the plug on the experimental programs," she hesitated, swallowing hard, "Eleanor won't get her treatment." James leaned back in his chair, pinching the bridge of his nose. For a moment he said nothing, letting the silence stretch between them as he processed the gravity of the situation. "If this is true," he began slowly, his tone heavy with the realization, "then Martin didn't just put the company at risk. He put real lives on the line." "We have to stop him, James," Cassidy said urgently. "We can't let him get away with this." James nodded, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. "It's not that simple." He knew better than anyone how dangerous Martin could be. "If we move too fast, he'll cover his tracks," James warned. "He's good at this. If we expose him the wrong way, he'll spin it back on us. And he won't just ruin you, Cassidy. He'll take the entire company down with him." Cassidy clenched her jaw, frustration boiling just beneath the surface. "So what are we supposed to do? Just wait? Hope he doesn't hurt anyone else?" "No." James's voice was firm, though his expression remained thoughtful. "We'll stop him. But we have to be smart about it. If we're not careful, he'll make sure Eleanor never gets that treatment, and he'll make you the scapegoat for all of this." The truth of James's words hit her hard, but Cassidy didn't waver. She had been through too much to back down now. "I won't let Martin destroy everything. Not after I've come this far." "Then tell me what to do," she said, meeting James's gaze head-on. "Because I'm not going to let him win." James exhaled slowly, as if weighing the risks in his mind. We need more than just these documents. We need solid evidence, something airtight that he can't deny or spin. We'll need to catch him in the act. Cassidy nodded, her mind already racing ahead. I know someone who might help. Lisa, she works in internal investigations. She's sharp and knows how Martin operates. If anyone can dig up more on him, it's her. James gave her a tight smile, a flicker of approval in his eyes. Good. Loop her in, but keep it quiet. The fewer people who know, the better. Cassidy's jaw tightened with determination. I can do this. James leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. And Cassidy, be careful. If Martin gets wind of this before we're ready, he didn't finish the sentence, but the warning was clear. Martin wouldn't hesitate to bury her if it meant saving himself. Cassidy held his gaze. I know what I'm risking. James nodded slowly, admiration flickering briefly across his face. I trust you, Cassidy. Just, don't do anything reckless. A wry smile tugged at the corner of her lips. No promises. James let out a soft chuckle, the tension between them easing for a brief moment. Of course not. But beneath the humor, they both knew the stakes. One wrong move could unravel everything. Later that night, Cassidy sat alone in the quiet of the hospital room, Eleanor sleeping peacefully beside her. The sound of the heart monitor beeped softly in the background, a steady reminder of how little time they had left. Cassidy gently brushed a stray strand of hair from Eleanor's forehead, her heart heavy. I'll fix this. I have to. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Lisa. Meet me first thing tomorrow. I have something. Cassidy's heart skipped a beat. This is it. This is the break I need. She glanced at Eleanor, then back at her phone. The pieces were finally starting to come together, but the real fight was just beginning. The next morning, Cassidy met Lisa in a secluded conference room tucked away on the far side of the office. Lisa sat cross-legged at the end of the long glass table, her laptop open, fingers flying over the keyboard with practiced ease. She barely looked up as Cassidy slipped in and shut the door quietly behind her. I've been waiting for this, Lisa said with a mischievous smile, her eyes still fixed on the screen. Martin's been acting like I don't exist for years. Big mistake. Cassidy pulled out a chair, studying Lisa closely. She'd never paid much attention to her before. Lisa had always kept to herself, quiet and unassuming, blending into the background like furniture. But now Cassidy could see the sharpness behind her eyes, the subtle edge of someone who had been watching everything, waiting for her moment to strike. He thinks I'm invisible, Lisa continued, her voice low but filled with satisfaction. Let's show him what happens when he underestimates the wrong people. Cassidy leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. What do you have? Lisa's fingers stopped flying, and she spun the laptop toward Cassidy. I've been tracking Martin's activities for a while. Nothing official, just personal interest. Call it a hobby. Cassidy raised an eyebrow. A hobby? Lisa shrugged with a sly grin. People have knitting. I like hunting down corporate criminals. Cassidy couldn't help but laugh under her breath, the tension loosening just a little. For the first time in days, she felt like she wasn't fighting this battle alone. Lisa clicked a folder open on the screen, revealing a neatly organized collection of documents, emails, and internal memos. I've got the whole web mapped out. Unauthorized trials. Patient data manipulation. Payments routed through shell accounts. Cassidy's heart thudded in her chest as she scanned the files. This wasn't just shady, it was catastrophic. And the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Martin had gone to great lengths to cover his tracks. These are good, Cassidy whispered, scrolling through the emails. But it's not enough. If we're going to take him down, we need more. Something that ties him directly to the patients. Something he can't deny. Lisa's eyes sparkled with something close to excitement. That's the fun part. She reached into her bag and pulled out a slim USB drive, spinning it between her fingers like a magician about to reveal a trick. I've been waiting for the right moment to use this. What's on it? Cassidy asked, leaning closer. A recording, Lisa said, grinning like the cat that ate the canary. Martin, on a conference call with a research team, authorizing one of the unauthorized trials. He thought the meeting wasn't being recorded. But lucky for us, the system had an automatic backup. Cassidy's breath caught. You're kidding. Lisa smirked. I don't kid about things like this. She plugged the USB into the laptop and played a snippet of the audio. Martin's smooth, authoritative voice filled the room, unmistakably directing the team to move forward without patient consent. "This'll bury him," Cassidy whispered, adrenaline buzzing through her veins. "With this, we've got him." Lisa nodded, satisfaction radiating from her. "And the best part? He won't see it coming." Cassidy felt the weight on her chest lift slightly, replaced by a fierce determination. "We can do this. We can stop him." Over the next few days, they worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence they could. Cassidy spent hours poring over emails and patient reports, while Lisa chased down loose ends, using her knowledge of the company's systems to fill in the gaps. The more they uncovered, the more dangerous it became. Cassidy could feel the noose tightening. Martin was starting to suspect something. He'd been watching her more closely in meetings, his polite mask slipping just enough to reveal the tension underneath. "We don't have much time," Lisa warned one afternoon, her voice low as they huddled over their laptops in a cramped meeting room. "He's getting nervous. We need to move soon." Cassidy nodded, her stomach knotting with anxiety. "If we don't act now, he'll bury this, and us with it." But even as they closed in on the final pieces of evidence, Cassidy knew they were walking a razor's edge. One wrong move, and everything could collapse. Lisa glanced up from her screen, her expression serious. "You're sure about this, right? Once we drop this on him, there's no going back." Cassidy met her gaze, the weight of the decision settling over her. "If I back down now, Eleanor won't get the treatment. And Martin will keep hurting people." "I'm sure," Cassidy said firmly. "We have to do this." Lisa gave a small nod, her lips curving into a determined smile. "Then let's finish this." Late one evening, after everyone else had left the office, Cassidy sat alone in the dim glow of her screen, double-checking their work. Every email, every document, every audio file, everything had to be perfect. Her phone buzzed on the desk beside her. It was a message from Lisa. "It's ready. We can drop it on him tomorrow morning." Cassidy exhaled slowly, the weight of the past few days pressing down on her shoulders. "This is it. No turning back now." She texted back, "I'll see you first thing." Then, without thinking, she opened her messages to James. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she typed, "We're almost there. Tomorrow it's over." His reply came quickly. "I trust you. Be careful." Cassidy stared at the message for a long moment, a strange mix of fear and resolve swirling inside her. This has to work. It has to. The next morning, Cassidy and Lisa stood outside the boardroom, the evidence ready to be presented. "Ready to blow this thing wide open?" Lisa asked, flashing her a grin. Cassidy took a deep breath and gave a small, determined nod. "Let's end this." Martin Blake knew something was wrong the moment he walked into the office that morning. The usual hum of activity felt off, too quiet, like the calm before a storm. He caught fleeting glances from employees as they passed, their expressions guarded, as if they knew something he didn't. He hated that feeling. Control. Always stay in control. But this time, it was slipping through his fingers. At his desk, Martin opened his email to find a flagged message from IT. A large data transfer was accessed in the early hours. Internal files. Private ones. His stomach twisted. Someone had gotten into his records. His mind raced, piecing it together. Cassidy Hart. That nosy little upstart. She wasn't just another disposable employee. She'd been digging. And if she found what he thought she did, everything was about to come crashing down. Martin sprang into action. He called a contact in the experimental division, his voice low and dangerous. "Shut down the Hart case immediately. Pull her grandmother from the treatment list. I don't care what it takes. Make it disappear." There was a brief hesitation on the other end of the line. "But, Mr. Blake, the patient is mid-treatment." "Do it," Martin snapped. "And if anyone asks, it was a clinical error. Handle it." Meanwhile, Cassidy sat in the conference room with Lisa and James, nerves buzzing under her skin. Every document, every email, every recording they had collected was laid out in front of them like weapons ready for battle. "You good?" Lisa asked, giving Cassidy a reassuring nudge. Cassidy inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "I have to be." James, standing by the door, gave her a quiet nod. "We've got your back." That's when the door opened, and in walked Martin, his presence filling the room like a toxic cloud. His smile was thin, sharp as a knife, but Cassidy saw the flicker of panic behind his eyes. He knew. He was just trying to stay ahead of the fallout. "Well, well," Martin said smoothly, closing the door behind him. "What's this all about? A little secret meeting without me." "Take a seat, Martin," James said, his voice calm but edged with authority. Martin gave him a smirk but didn't move. "I don't think so. If you have something to say, say it." Cassidy stood, gripping the edge of the table to steady herself. "We know what you've been doing. The unauthorized trials. The patients you put at risk without their consent." Martin's smirk faltered for just a second, but he quickly recovered. "That's a bold accusation. You're going to need more than rumors if you want to back it up." "We've got more than rumors," Lisa interjected with a grin, folding her arms. "Try recordings, emails, bank transactions. You've been busy, Martin." Martin's jaw tightened. "If you release any of that, you'll be bringing down the entire company. You think the board will let you walk away from this unscathed? You'll be out of a job before the day's over." Cassidy stepped forward, eyes locked on his. "I don't care what happens to me. But I care about the people you hurt. I care about my grandmother." Her voice hardened. "And you tried to pull her treatment, didn't you?" Martin's expression darkened, the pretense of charm slipping away. "I did what I had to do. It's called damage control. Something you'd understand if you weren't so naive." James moved closer, his presence steady and unyielding beside Cassidy. "What you did wasn't damage control, Martin. It was reckless. It was criminal. You don't get it, do you?" Martin snapped, his calm mask cracking. "This is how things work. Companies like ours survive by cutting corners, by taking risks. If you don't like it, maybe you're in the wrong business." Cassidy held his gaze, her hands clenched at her sides. "If this is what it takes to survive, then it's not a business worth saving." Martin scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Spare me the moral speech. You won't make it past today without me. I've been holding this place together while you play hero." He turned to James, sneering. "You think these people will follow her? A waitress you picked up off the street." James's expression didn't waver. "I trust her more than I ever trusted you." Lisa stepped forward, holding up the USB drive with a satisfied smirk. "And just so you know, everything you said? We've got it. Recorded. The board is going to love hearing all about your damage control." For the first time, real fear flickered across Martin's face. "You're making a mistake," he hissed, his voice sharp and desperate. "You'll regret this." "Maybe," Cassidy said coolly. "But not as much as you will." The door to the conference room swung open, and two uniformed officers stepped inside. One of the company's legal representatives followed behind them, clipboard in hand. "Martin Blake," one of the officers asked. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Martin's face twisted with rage as the officers moved toward him. "You think this ends here?" he snarled at Cassidy. "You think you've won? I'll bury all of you." Cassidy didn't flinch. She stood tall, her heart pounding but steady, watching as the officers cuffed Martin's hands behind his back. "Get him out of here," James said quietly, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's sentence. As Martin was led out of the room, his threats fading into the distance, the tension in Cassidy's chest finally loosened. She felt the weight of everything, weeks of fear, uncertainty, and desperation, begin to lift. James stood beside her, silent for a moment, then turned to meet her gaze. "You did it," he said simply. There was no grand declaration, no applause, just a quiet acknowledgement of the battle they had fought and won. Cassidy exhaled slowly, the reality of it settling over her. "We did it." James gave her a rare, genuine smile. "You saved your grandmother. And you saved the company." Cassidy allowed herself a small, tired smile in return. "Guess I'm not just a waitress after all." James chuckled softly, the sound warm and relieved. "Not even close." For the first time in what felt like forever, Cassidy let herself believe that things might actually be okay. The fight was over, or at least this one was. And for now, that was enough. Eleanor's breathing had steadied, a soft rise and fall beneath the thin blanket. Her color was better, her face no longer drawn with the same relentless exhaustion that had weighed on her for months. The experimental treatment was finally working, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Cassidy saw life returning to her grandmother's fragile body. Cassidy sat beside the bed, her fingers lightly clasping Eleanor's hand. The weariness in her bones was overwhelming. Weeks of stress, sleepless nights, and constant battles had taken their toll. But for the first time, she could breathe. Truly breathe. It was over. The chaos, the fear, the feeling of running on fumes, it was behind her now. Eleanor's eyelids fluttered open, her pale blue eyes slowly focusing on Cassidy. A tired but genuine smile curled on her lips. "Hi, sweetheart," Eleanor whispered, her voice weak but warmer than it had been in weeks. Cassidy squeezed her hand, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. "We did it, Grandma," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "We made it. You're going to be okay." Eleanor's smile widened, and she reached up with her other hand to brush a stray tear off Cassidy's cheek with her thumb. "I told you," Eleanor murmured, her eyes sparkling with quiet pride. "I knew you'd find a way." Cassidy let out a soft laugh, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. "You always did know better." She leaned forward, resting her forehead gently against Eleanor's. "You were right, Grandma. We made it." The two of them stayed like that for a moment. No words needed, just the silent understanding between two people who had held each other up through the hardest of times. Eleanor gave Cassidy's hand another squeeze. "You did good, kiddo," she whispered. "You fought like hell." Cassidy closed her eyes, exhaling slowly. "I learned from the best." James stood just outside the hospital room, watching the quiet scene unfold through the small window in the door. He stayed in the hallway, reluctant to intrude on such a personal moment, but the sight of Cassidy, finally allowing herself to let go, struck him in a way he hadn't expected. He'd spent so long building walls around himself, avoiding personal attachments, always convinced that getting close to someone would only lead to more pain. But here he was, watching Cassidy, and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest: hope. Cassidy had fought with everything she had to save Eleanor. And along the way, she had saved more than just her grandmother. She had saved herself. And in a way James didn't quite understand yet, she had saved him too. For a long moment he stood there, leaning against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, just watching. Cassidy glanced up then, catching sight of him through the glass. She smiled, a soft, genuine smile that lit up her face, a world away from the guarded, exhausted expression she'd worn when he first found her on that bench. James pushed the door open quietly and stepped inside. "How's she doing?" he asked in a low voice, his gaze flickering to Eleanor, whose tired but peaceful eyes now rested on him. Cassidy gave a small nod. "Better. The treatment's working." James allowed himself a small smile. "Good. That's good." Eleanor's gaze shifted from Cassidy to James, and her lips curved in a knowing grin. "So this must be the mysterious Mr. Ford," she said, her voice still soft but teasing. Cassidy rolled her eyes affectionately. "Grandma." Eleanor gave James an approving once-over. "I like him," she whispered conspiratorially to Cassidy, loud enough for James to hear. James chuckled, the sound low and warm. "She's tough," he said, glancing at Cassidy. "You should be proud." Eleanor gave a slow, contented nod. "Oh, I am," she whispered, her eyes fluttering closed as fatigue started to pull her under. "More than you'll ever know." Cassidy brushed a hand gently over Eleanor's forehead, watching as her grandmother drifted off into a peaceful sleep. For a moment, she stayed still, just watching Eleanor's steady breathing, as if needing to assure herself that this wasn't a dream. When she finally looked back at James, her expression softened. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything. I don't know how we would have made it without you." James shook his head, meeting her gaze. "You did the hard part, Cassidy. I just helped you see it through." Cassidy smiled, a real smile this time, not one weighed down by worry or fear. "Still, you were there when it mattered." James held her gaze for a moment, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. There was no grand declaration, no sweeping moment of realization, just two people who had been through the worst and come out the other side, stronger for it. In the following weeks, life slowly began to settle into something that resembled normal. Eleanor grew stronger with each passing day, and Cassidy found herself adjusting to a new routine, one that didn't revolve around constant fear and crisis management. Back at the office, James kept his word. The company, now free from Martin's toxic grip, began to thrive under a new direction, one built on transparency, ethics, and real innovation. Cassidy's role in the startup grew naturally, and with every passing day, she felt more at home in a place she never thought she belonged. She and James found themselves working together more closely, their partnership evolving into something that felt effortless. Their shared battles had forged a bond between them, one built not just on trust, but on mutual respect. And maybe, just maybe, something more. One afternoon, as they stood on the rooftop terrace overlooking the city, Cassidy turned to James with a thoughtful expression. "What now?" she asked softly, the wind teasing her hair as she leaned on the railing beside him. James glanced at her, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Now? We keep going. We build something better. Something we can be proud of." Cassidy nodded, a quiet sense of peace settling over her. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel like something to fear. They stood there together, side by side, gazing out at the skyline, two people who had found their way through the darkness and were ready finally to start again. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning. And whatever came next, they would face it together.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.